Good afternoon, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Deb Hackathorn. I'm the Senior Vice President of Civic Point, a government affairs firm, and a member of CMC's Board of Trustees. Today's forum is supported by the Columbus Dispatch and sponsored by BDO, Fifth Third Bank, the Robert Weiler Company, and Keeler and Nadler Family Wealth. Thank you to today's forum partner, the Workforce Development Board of Central Ohio. Our live stream is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. Let's thank all of those who are supporting our forum today. After a tumultuous 2021, both politically and economically, what's in store for Central Ohio in 2022? Well, today we'll hear what the year ahead looks like for the Columbus economy from our leading panel of experts. To introduce today's speakers, please welcome to the stage Stephanie Green, Managing Director with today's forum sponsor, Fifth Third Private Banking. Stephanie?
Thank you, Deb, and thank you, Columbus Metropolitan Club. Fifth Third Bank is really proud to support Columbus Metropolitan Club as we convene weekly conversations on important community topics. We are better as a community when many come together to discuss the matters of the times. Fifth Third continues to strongly support our local communities. Just last year, we announced a $20 million investment for the Pack neighborhood on the Near East Side, while also providing more than 5,000 hours of community service throughout Central Ohio. And for over 160 years, Fifth Third has provided customized, tailored wealth management solutions, helping individuals, businesses, and institutions build, preserve, and manage their wealth. A record stock market looms in stark contrast to the economic uncertainty and reality for many Americans. The global pandemic has caused seismic shifts in consumer behavior, supply chain constraints, and now rising inflation. Business is still anything but normal. Predicting the future is tricky business, but listening to our trusted experts for insight, good data, and guidance will aid us as we look ahead. And now, please join me in welcoming today's speakers. Mr. Doug Buchanan, Editor-in-Chief of the Columbus Business First. Dr. Fadhel Kaboub, Associate Professor of Economics with Denison University and President of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Mr. Bill LaFayette, owner of Regionomics, and of course, our moderator, Mr. Mark Williams, business reporter for the Columbus Dispatch. You can learn more about today's speakers in your forum flyer. Mark, we look forward to today's conversation.
Well, Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks a lot for being here. And for those of you watching on YouTube, thanks a lot for tuning in. A special thanks to those of you on YouTube who've bought virtual seats. Thanks to my fellow panelists, and a big thanks to my friends at CMC for making this forum, this forecast, the first forum of the year now for 21 years. The economy was in recovery last year, and recovery is going to continue this year. U.S. gross domestic product passed its pre-pandemic peak last spring. Not so employment, though. As of November, U.S. and Columbus metro area employment was still about 2.5% below where it was in February 2020. Ohio employment was about 4% below. It looks like year-over-year U.S. employment growth was 2.7% in 2021, its best one-year gain since 1994. That, of course, followed its worst one-year loss since they started keeping records in 1939. As it looks now, Central Ohio underperformed the national average with a gain of 2.2%. However, as I've pointed out here in previous years, the employment estimates that we have now are preliminary and are going to be revised come March. I am really suspicious of the recent behavior of some of the Central Ohio estimates. Lots of trends look too low. I tried to reflect that in my forecast by restating the 2021 trends, but I wasn't terribly aggressive at doing that. The government estimates imply 2.1% growth rather than my 2.2. So we could still very well get a nice surprise come March, but maybe not quite the 2.6% that I predicted last January, but we'll see. So if at first you don't succeed, try again. I'm predicting a gain of 2.8% for 2022, a net gain of 30,100 jobs. That may sound pretty far out there, but it really isn't. The national level forecasts are, for the most part, expecting growth of 3.8% to 4%. But those forecasts, I think, implicitly assume labor force growth that might be overly optimistic. I'll come back to that point in a minute. Gains should be especially good here in Central Ohio in professional and technical services, whose employment, I think, was probably fairly sharply understated last year, transportation, and the catch-all sector, other services. Our one problem child this year is likely to be state government employment. It declined last year, and it should decline again this year, but perhaps by less. The complete forecast is available on my website, regionomicsllc.com, under publications. In addition to the pandemic, the workforce problem has been and remains the big question mark in our economic recovery. My own seasonally adjusted estimates show an unemployment rate in Central Ohio in November of 3.3%. That ties the lowest rate of the expansion before the pandemic. The U.S. rate was 4.2%. But the reason why the rate is so low is that the number of people working has been increasing while the labor force has been essentially stuck in neutral since the summer of 2020 and is 20,000 less than it was just before the pandemic hit. The number of people unemployed and actively looking for work in Central Ohio is down more than a third since February 2020. That's 36,700, its lowest point in more than 20 years when our region's economy was much smaller than it is now. Job openings nationwide and in Ohio are at all-time highs. The national total is half again as high as it was before COVID. The number quitting their job is also at an all-time high. What's behind all this? Well, lots of people thought that it was the supplemental unemployment payments that were keeping people out of the labor force. Discontinue the payments, they argued, and people would rush off to the jobs websites and the problems would be solved. It actually reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. H.L. Mencken once said, "For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong." We saw that answer was wrong as early as last summer. Missouri, for example, ended their supplemental payments on June 12. Workforce officials saw virtually no increase in applicants in the first few weeks after that payment ended. Missouri's labor force this past November was actually a bit less than it was in June. According to the job matching site Indeed, clicks on job postings in states that ended their benefit during that time were below average. Some have said that it's been older workers using the pandemic as an excuse to take early retirement. Judging from the numbers, that is an explanation, but only a partial one. Labor force participation since the pandemic broke is down in all age groups except the 16 to 19-year age group, which is up a touch. Higher wages and less competition from older workers, it seems, have brought young people into the labor market, which is helpful both for them and for the economy. Part of the problem is certainly the cost and limited availability of childcare. Childcare can cost north of $10,000 per year, which is a strain for even middle-income parents. But partly, I think what we're seeing now is the outcome of a long-term trend. Workers have been getting a smaller share of productivity gains and national income for years. The wealth gap between the richest and poorest households doubled between 1989 and 2016. The median earnings of black households are 61% of those of white households, and that ratio has barely changed since 1970. According to the Ohio Association of Community Action Agencies, a single adult in Franklin County needs $12.09 an hour full-time to cover basic living expenses without assistance. Add a preschooler, and you're up to $23.69 an hour. About 5 of every 6 jobs in Central Ohio paid more than $12.09 in 2020, but fewer than half paid more than $23.69. Many of those low-wage jobs include no benefits and undesirable working conditions. Now those working conditions include the possibility of exposure to COVID in many cases. Meanwhile, the long-term drive to do more with less and now the Great Resignation are leading to smaller staffs, more burnout, more job dissatisfaction, and more resignations. So we may be setting ourselves up for what will become a vicious cycle. Workers know that they're in demand and they're bargaining for higher wages, better benefits, and better working conditions, in some cases by either striking or by voting with their feet. Part of the solution is to increase wages, but simply relying on that may be as unproductive as was ending the unemployment supplements. Employers also need to think carefully about benefits and working conditions. Obviously, the working conditions answer is going to be different for a corporate headquarters than for a fast food restaurant, but the need to consider employee well-being is the same. Thanks again for being here in person or virtually. I wish you all a happy, healthy, productive 2022. Mark, we're all yours.
I seem like I have more stuff this year. Happy New Year to all of you. I am thrilled to see you all this year. I mean, it's so good to see people after last year when Bill, Doug, and I were basically alone for Bill's forecast. Don't get me wrong, I love Bill and Doug, but the last thing I want for this year's forecast was to be stuck with these two talking about our failed visits to Hair Club for Men. The one thing that Bill's forecast has in common with 21 is COVID. The economy as we know it can't get back to normal until COVID is brought under control around the world. Fadhel will talk about that in a couple minutes. There have been no winners when it comes to COVID and the economy, with the exception of all the fraudsters who've made off with billions of dollars in unemployment benefits and other federal stimulus dollars. But a lot of us have been more fortunate than others. I consider myself one of the lucky ones. For starters, I kept my job. We lost 22 million jobs across the country in the early days of the pandemic and almost 900,000 in Ohio. I've been able to work from home, hanging out with my dog, who looks strangely at me when I start talking about PE ratios or some obtuse element in some earnings report. Thanks to the stock market, my savings for retirement have not been higher. Did you know that the S&P, the benchmark for most of us when we are gauging our returns, hit 70 records in 2021 and rose 27% last year? Then there's the value of my home, which has never been higher. Meanwhile, millions of workers who lost their jobs because of the pandemic have struggled to come up with enough money to pay rent, their mortgage, the utilities, and food. COVID has taken the wealth gap between those who are well off and those who aren't and put it on steroids. One study has found that America's wealthiest people have seen their wealth jump by more than $1.3 trillion during the pandemic. I write about jobs and the economy. I've heard more horrible stories from workers during the pandemic than at any point in 40 years in journalism. Most of these stories have been tied to our state's unemployment system and its failure to serve those who depend on these badly needed benefits. On a perfect day, the state's system of handling unemployment claims isn't great. But a year ago, the system was overwhelmed with claims and a lot of fraud. I've talked to widows whose husbands' names were used to file fraudulent claims. I talked to a woman in California who had never even been to Ohio who had a claim filed in her name. Fraudulent claims were filed in the names of the governor and the lieutenant governor. A fraudulent claim was filed in my name. Meanwhile, plenty of workers with legitimate claims had to spend months trying to get their unemployment benefits, so long that it put many at risk of losing all they had worked for, including a grandma in Akron who parked her car in a lot away from her apartment complex so that the repo guy couldn't find it, and a musician in Columbus I spoke to who was on the verge of being evicted before he finally got his benefits. As Bill pointed out in his forecast, job growth should be strong in Ohio and the U.S. this year. There's a website called tracktherecovery.org that has been a great resource for me in my reporting over the past year. The latest data show that Ohio has recovered all of its middle and high wage jobs lost during the pandemic, but we're still missing nearly a fifth of our low wage jobs. I think some of this is good news. I suspect a chunk of these jobs maybe have become middle-class jobs because of the boost we've seen in wages, but we still have a long way to go for those who have been hurt the most economically by the pandemic. I thought 2020 was as weird of a year we could possibly have. Then along came 21, which said, "Hold my beer, watch this." It started a year ago when Bill, on this same Wednesday, I know the anniversary is tomorrow, but on this same Wednesday when Bill and Doug and I were here for Bill's forecast, and we saw the U.S. Capitol get overrun. I went home from that forecast and remember being horrified as I watched those events unfold on television. It put in plain view our partisan divide in this country that is as extreme as any as I can remember since I was a kid and my brother went off to fight in the Vietnam War. Of course, we all had hoped that 21 would mark the end of COVID. Instead, our cases are at record levels. Supply chain problems have gotten worse, but instead of toilet paper, it's cars and appliances and cream cheese and headstones that we can't get. Inflation is the worst it's been in 30 years. All of us have seen how much prices have jumped on everything from gasoline to groceries to finding a place to live. Companies complain they can't find workers. Do you know we have more openings right now than people looking for work? In this report today, 1 million, I read this morning, 1 million restaurant and hotel workers quit their job in November, just that 1 month. Workers are telling their bosses, take this job and shove it at record levels. Last year through November, 43 million people quit their jobs. Who can blame them? Many are burned out and exhausted. So now we're looking at 2022, and about the only thing that could make this year weirder than the prior two is if the Bengals were to win the Super Bowl. Even with the supply chain problems, inflation and employee shortages, we know the economy is doing well. We also know that the government is pulling back on the stimulus that's helped support the economy over the past 2 years, and that ultra-low interest rates are coming to an end. We've heard Bill's forecast. Now let's get our other panelists involved. Fadhel, I'm hoping you can kind of kick us off on giving us your outlook for the national and global economy. There's a lot to think about. What's top of mind for you?
Inflation. I'm going to be your inflation person today. Not because I made it up, but because it's real. So to be very clear in terms of what we're dealing with, we need to sort out the inflation pressure points that pre-existed before COVID, and then talk about the inflation pressure points that have materialized since then, and then figure out what we're about to do and how we can handle them. It's very clear that the Federal Reserve Bank has told us that they're going to raise interest rates at least 3 times in the coming year, because that's the only tool they have to fight inflation. And I will argue today that that's actually the wrong federal agency to deal with inflation for the following reasons. Pre-COVID, the 4 major drivers of inflation at the national level are healthcare, education, energy and transportation, and housing, real estate. Now, those 4 areas, when you think of what drives inflation, it's 2 subcomponents. One is what I sometimes describe as abusive market power. You raise prices simply because you can, because you dominate the market. And 2, because of shortage or lack of productive capacity, lack of availability of affordable housing, lack of availability of healthcare staff, and so on. Now, those 2 things, lack of physical productive capacity and market power, those are the sources of inflation. There is nothing the Federal Reserve Bank or any central bank around the world can do to actually address those sources. It's way outside their jurisdiction. As a matter of fact, raising interest rates may actually make it worse in those areas. Number 2, with COVID, we've discovered new inflation pressure points related to the global supply chains. And everybody now is familiar with the concept of inflation driven by global supply chains in terms of shortages of, products shipped from China, from other parts of the world. That's COVID related, meaning every time we have a wave of COVID disruptions globally, it's going to ripple through the entire system. And that not only affects the shortage of physical products, but also feeds the abusive market power that I described. In recent months, we've heard from many corporations and corporate CEOs saying the pricing environment is favorable, and record profits have been reported in the last few months. And it's simply because they can. Now, when you talk about workers saying we're not going back to these jobs, when we talk about the missing 80,000 truck drivers, when we talk about all of the labor shortages, it has to do with this cumulative effect of the pre-pandemic, the pandemic, the cost of living, the inequality. All of these things are materialized in the labor market. And we're not going to address that by raising interest rates. That's number 1. And number 2, we're not going to address any of the inflation pressure points by having the federal government spend less. So how do we deal with it? As far as I'm concerned, spending more at the federal level strategically to increase productive capacity in key areas. Number 2, tax and regulate abusive market power, AKA antitrust laws. So you tame the abusive market power. And number 3, ultimately, ending the global pandemic at a global scale. Because every time there's a global disruption, it's going to ripple through and it's going to affect everybody, including this economy, obviously. So I'm not very optimistic about where we're going, because we've handed the keys for the economy right now to the Fed, and the Fed has a hammer, and the only thing it sees is a nail, so it's going to hit it at least 3 times this year, and it's not going to affect inflation. And the federal government, Congress, the 535 people we sent to Washington, D.C., have essentially told us that they're not going to spend more because they fear inflation, and that they are not going to go after abusive market power. They're not going to do whatever it takes to cooperate with the global leadership to actually end the pandemic and end the spread of new variants and development of new variants. So I think we're going to see more inflation for these reasons. And I think we're going to see more confrontation between workers and corporations in this country for sure. And I think consumers are going to be the arbitrator of this struggle. And I want this to be front and center in our public discourse. Unfortunately, it's not there yet because most people believe that the Fed will take care of it. So I'll leave it at that.
So Doug, you guys at Business First write a lot about real estate and construction, and anyone who drives around town can see all the work that's been going on, and we know it's smoking hot. Right. We know it's smoking hot, and we're going to have higher interest rates. So what kind of what are you? And we've seen how low our supply of houses for sale and all that kind of thing is. What do you all see when you're looking at real estate in 22?
I mean, we see continued growth in building everything. I really can't think of a sector that's down at the moment because we need everything. We need housing. We need all kinds of housing. We need warehouses. We do need offices. That's a subject for an upcoming CMC. But I just see that the demand is outstripping the available supply in just about anywhere you look, any sector of the city you look. And so, if they can build it more quickly, they would. But it's the problems that Bill talked about with workforce. It's rising costs that are making some projects untenable. So, but again, we're talking about basically jobs here. I think that is one sector that you're going to continue to see robust growth if they can find the workers.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Would you see higher interest rates, slowing any of this stuff down, or does that, or there's even with these increases we're talking about, the rates still are going to be low?
Well, right, and perhaps the folks from the Weiler Company here can chime in. But I mean, you can still build. I mean, you still have to. I think it's just like one of the other inputs on the cost that you're getting. If you can make the project work, you will. If you have to raise prices, you will. Mm-hmm. And so for an affordable housing perspective, it's terrible.
Yeah, Bill, you mentioned one thing in your report that I found interesting, and that is that the economy has fully recovered from the shock of the pandemic in terms of the actual size of the GDP. Yet we're doing that with a lot fewer workers. Can our panelists explain besides the fact that we're all worn out and tired and working harder, is there more to it than that?
That's it. The productivity has increased. We are doing more with less, as I said. We're working folks in lots of cases to the bone, and that's not going to serve us over the long run.
I was telling Bill earlier that his forecast. I don't remember ever having this much noise in his forecast. COVID would have been bad enough, but this workforce situation. How do you predict how many jobs are going to be created and hired when you really have no idea how many people are going to be out there actually looking for these jobs? And that is what we're seeing. It's white collar, it's blue collar, it's practically every industry that there is this great reckoning going on by workers about why am I doing this job and could I be doing something different?
And great reckoning is exactly what I've called it. It's a lot of very long-hatched chickens coming home to roost, I think. If we don't get increases in the labor force this year, a lot more than we've seen in prior years, we're not going to see 2.6%. No way.
There's a couple of things at play here. There's jobless growth, which is not new. This is the whole thing about capitalism. You bring in new technology to displace labor, but our innovation historically to catch up with technological innovation is to train and educate and improve technical skills, because the jobs of the future are always going to be higher technically in terms of technical requirements and skills and education. The question is, are we investing enough to build the workforce of the future job market, of the new technologies, the digital infrastructure, the artificial intelligence, the robotics? We're not. And that's a big problem. The second factor, as you said, Bill, in terms of chickens coming home to roost, this decoupling between the gains in productivity And the distribution of those gains has been happening since the 70s, since the 80s, and it's been accelerating. And that's what feeds the inequality gap. So the gains from productivity are going to the top, not being distributed to workers or middle-class consumers. How did we keep our economy growing with the working class that's not gaining income in real terms to keep up with the gains in productivity? Well, access to credit. Credit in terms of this massive consumer debt that we have, the student loan debt crisis, all of these things can kind of patch the economy for a while, but we're coming to the edge of what the system can handle. And I think this is a public discourse. This is a national conversation that requires national, federal intervention, not patchwork interventions at city levels or state levels. I'll give you an example. When we talk about cost of living and affordable housing, last time I checked, and you can look it up quickly on your phones probably, the MIT Living Wage Database, if I remember correctly, for a family of 3 or 4 probably, with one person working and one person at home, the living wage in Franklin County is north of $20 an hour. Are we there? Are those jobs there? Well, then no wonder people are not accepting those jobs, because these are not affordable housing in this city, in many cities around the world. This is not going to happen if we have more gentrification, if we have a handful of hedge funds and real estate investment trusts in this country who gobbled up all housing, rental properties essentially, since 2008. Who's going to address this? It's not the city of Columbus. This is the federal government's responsibility. So we have to tackle all of these things systematically, simultaneously, on the education front, on the housing front, on the student debt crisis front, on the pandemic front, all of these things at once. Otherwise, we're just, playing a game of whack-a-mole. We address one thing and 5 things pop up.
I said on this stage a number of years ago that what we really need is a Marshall Plan for education and training. And I certainly hope that we get it.
Just echoing what Bill and Fadhel said, that the investment, if we could have a greater investment in training, public investment, because what have we seen over the past several years? We've seen companies just take it on themselves, partnering with Columbus State, partnering, I'm sure, with the Workforce Development Board and Lisa's team, and just, they have no choice, because otherwise, you have to create the workers and not just hope that they show up.
Which is great, but it's not sufficient and it's not systematic to run the largest economy in the world based on this patchwork type of, small-scale interventions.
Yeah, and you have to be a larger company to even be able to do that in the first place. So then the small business owners, they're going to get left with nothing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk quickly about supply chain a little bit more. Drive by any auto dealership and you see plenty of empty spots where vehicles once sat. I get some of the problem. Our economy is largely driven by us paying for services. But with COVID, we've been stuck at home, and instead of buying services, we're buying stuff. And all that stuff that we're buying is now backed up at international ports because the people that are making that stuff overseas, they're all dealing with COVID as well. Is there something? Is it just really that simple that our supply chains have just been overwhelmed? I've seen some of the data that talk about how much more retail sales have gone up so much and all this other stuff in the past couple of years. Is it really just that simple? And if it's just that simple, I assume this stuff will calm down in 22.
Only if the pandemic is under
calmed
control.
down.
Yeah.
That's
So
certainly part of the problem. But so was the speed at which we reopened. We reopened early last year, late in 2020, at this blinding speed. And we had GDP growth north of 6% the first half of 2021. And even in the best of circumstances, that would have strained labor markets, it would have strained the supply chain. But we had on top of that a supply chain that essentially shut down for several months early in 2020.
In terms of supply chains, when you had the first COVID disruption, and when you're, for example, meat packing companies in the US are producing the meat, cutting it, ready to deliver, the packaging, there's shortage of styrofoam packaging. When you face that constraint, the next order you're placing, you're going to order 3 times what you need in terms of styrofoam packaging. Now, all of a sudden, your producers in China are getting 3 times the global demand for everything because everybody's panicking about running out of resources to deliver to their customers. The global supply chain was not built to handle 3 times the global economy. We just don't have it. Right? So those disruptions are still there and will continue, which means shipping containers, shortages. Wooden pallets, you can't ship anything without wooden pallets, shortages all over the world. So those disruptions are not going to go away unless we deal with the pandemic. Now, that also started a new phenomenon that we haven't seen before in the global economy. Just like workers here in the US are looking at their employers and saying, we're not going to take those wages, you have companies in China and other parts of the world who deal with customers like Walmart, for example. Walmart, we think of it as the biggest seller in the US retail market, but at the same time, in the global economy, it's the biggest buyer from small manufacturer, from small companies, and it's a price setter with those small manufacturers. Now, with the pandemic, those small manufacturers are able to push back against Walmart, against the big buyers, and say, well, here's our price. So that also disruption, which is reasonable when you think about it in terms of low-cost labor, low margins of profits across the global south in particular. So that adjustment is long overdue, and it's happening. So that becomes a question of, will U.S. retailers pass on the cost to customers or take a little bit from shareholders or something, right? So that's the readjustment that's long overdue in terms of distribution of income. And it's a question of power, of market power, of bargaining with producers, with workers, with consumers, with shareholders, with national governments being the arbiter of these big power shifts that are happening before our eyes. The only thing we see is inflation and these disruptions. But are we actually tackling this, this market power across the world, not just in the U.S.?
I will say one thing, that these supply chain issues may benefit Ohio in the long run, because you may start seeing more companies switch from, it was always just-in-time delivery, now they're saying it's just in case, so that you stockpile some things. I don't know if you saw the reports yesterday. Toyota outsold GM in the U.S. for the first time ever, and one of the reasons was that they had stockpiled all these chips that the car makers can't get, and so GM just had a capacity problem, and Toyota took advantage of it. So I think that with Ohio's position, I think we would stand to benefit if some of that supply chain were to reshore back into America.
Yeah, and certainly we've seen that. Doug, you and I wrote about this with this company called American Nitrile that wants to take over a warehouse in Grove City and make rubber gloves. And because these things were in, incredibly short supply in the early days of the pandemic. I mean, that's a product that's made typically in Southeast Asia. So if we can, if that company can make that product, profitably, yeah, we'll see how that goes. Okay, so we're going to move to questions from our live stream and in-person audience in just a couple of minutes. If you have a question, please make your way to the microphone now. But I have one more final thing I wanted to ask our panel about. I was reading a story the other day that points out that a fifth of men between the ages of 25 and 34 are living at home. There's also been a big decline in the number of men in the labor force. When I was young, I couldn't wait to get out of the house. Is it a failure to launch? Too much time spent playing video games? Medical issues with the various problems that we've talked about with the CMC has talked about over the years with opioids and other problems? I mean, what's going on?
I would say all of the above. Certainly, the student loan crisis that Fadhel's mentioned is really important. So's the cost of housing. It is very hard to get a decent apartment for less than $800 or $900 a month, and that is unaffordable for a lot of people who are just starting their careers, even if they're white-collar careers.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't emphasize this more than what Bill just said. It's just, I have lots of students who graduate from Denison and other places, so we talk a lot about what's next. And it's, again, if there is no good paying job, I'm going to just stay at home and maybe take some coding classes, learn something, volunteer in the community until the next job interview and the next career move presents itself, because the debt is crushing, the cost of living is crushing, especially for people who live in rural communities and where there is no local job market that matches your skills and aspirations. So for a lot of young people, it's moving to New York, moving to San Francisco, moving to the city, the big cities in the state. And the housing cost, the cost of living is just not an option where you just, make it there and then the job will materialize.
That question hits a little too close to home for me, so I'm going to take the fifth.
It is CMC's longstanding tradition, of course, to take audience questions. Jane Scott is taking questions from the live stream audience. For our in-house audience, please join Jane at the microphone. And of course, the whole spiel, keep your questions brief and to the point. Jane, what is our first question today?
Well, I have about 12 questions on the live stream already, so we'll go through them quickly and maybe have short answers too.
That's a good idea.
Great. And some of them are overlaps, so I'll do my best. Mindy Wright has a question. Does Dr. LaFayette have any data on the Great Resignation's impact on entrepreneurship?
Well, just anecdotal impacts. Entrepreneurship has certainly increased, and if you've listened to me pound the table about entrepreneurship before, you'll know that I'm very, very happy about that. But yeah, it certainly has had an impact.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Warren Fishman. First of all, I want to say I really appreciate this forum. I look forward to it every year, and this one was no exception for sure. But I have a question about Columbus. Everybody who lives here, most people who live here love Columbus. And what I see happening is that one of the attractions to Columbus for years and years, in my opinion, is low cost of living and Midwest atmosphere. What's happening is our rents are skyrocketing, prices of housing is skyrocketing. What we don't have in Columbus is mountains, ocean, and weather, okay? And if I was a young person, I might be attracted somewhere else. And I wonder how you feel about that impact, and you think you see a change in the horizon.
That's certainly been a concern of mine, the increasing cost of housing. We're still affordable when you compare us to a lot of other places, but we are certainly less affordable than other places in Ohio. And now that so many people can live wherever and take a job, say, in Columbus or Chicago, that might be their approach.
Yeah, one more quick point on that. I've had someone tell me that they believe that Columbus will add 1 million people in the next 12 or 15 years. 1 million people. That's 50% more than what we have now. And they have to live somewhere, and that's going to be interesting. And the other thing too, I live near Lancaster. I've never seen so many apartments go up in Lancaster since all time I've lived there, and I'm assuming it's the same for the other cities. I mean, Lancaster is a lot cheaper to live in than Columbus, and I would assume maybe we'll see some of that, people going to Newark or Marion or other places like that where they can find something that's more affordable.
We're still not building enough housing units to accommodate the household growth that we're seeing.
Jane.
That's a whole nother forum. Bevan Schneck, how does Dr. LaFayette see the federal infrastructure legislation affecting the region's jobs forecast and economy? And will that too be tempered by inflation?
Hi, Bevan. Well, yes, it will be tempered by inflation, no doubt about it. It all goes back to, can we get the workforce? That really is the question. And it is an open question.
Our next question.
Good afternoon. My name is Sean Marjadaksha. I'm principal of Bayer Environmental. My question is prior to the pandemic, we had an opioid pandemic, and since then, the opioid pandemic has skyrocketed. How much do you think the impact in the increase in substance abuse and drug use has impacted people not returning to work? It's very hard to stay sober when you're forced to work at home.
I haven't seen any specific statistics that tie the two, but the link is there. We've known this for a long time, not just in this country, but other countries. Every time we have increases in unemployment, we have increases in substance abuse and all kinds of social problems. And this is the social cost, right? This is really the unaffordable part of the pandemic, right? We're paying for it with blood, tears, and money, as I always say. So spending strategically the right way to address the sources of the problem is much, much more affordable than doing nothing. That's the cost of doing nothing. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's a really good point, and I also think one of the problems we may see with our workforce issues is the fact that people may not pass a drug test. So I'll give you this one quick point. I had a friend of mine. We were having a conversation a while ago. The guy works for a pipeline company over in eastern Ohio, and this was relayed third hand to him. A company needed to hire a truck driver, and to work in the oil and gas sector over there. And so the manager was talking to a worker about this. Hey, I really need you to work. The job, pays this, and this. Everything seemed great because you're going to need to pass a drug test. And the guy says, give me the test and I'll take it home so my wife can take it. So anyway, Jane.
Well, this is kind of a combined question. With the concentration of wealth and ownership of companies in the United States, that's one issue, but then the record performance of the stock market. A lot of us in this room probably own stock, so it's sort of a we love it, we don't love it kind of thing. How long do you think the stock market's going to be on this straight-up trajectory?
I'm not the stock market guy.
I'll take that one as best I can. All I know is if I knew where the stock market was going, I wouldn't be here right now. I would be making a ton of money. But no, I think you have to look at the stock market, and obviously the higher interest rates coming up this year will affect markets. We've already seen a big sell-off in the companies that are high growth but not profitable. You've seen those shares go down a lot. But I think when basically the stock market's doubled since the early days of the pandemic, and you have to think that that's going to be hard to maintain. It doesn't mean that there's not still value. I think, you see, if you watch CNBC enough, they'll always tell you that it's just right now, it's a stock picker's market as opposed to just buying the market in general. So it's hard to see it going up that much, but, as we know, markets can get way out of hand before they come back to earth. Okay, so next question.
Hello, my name is Jeffrey Lemichuk with CareSource. So my question is, 2021 was pretty solid business-wise, locally and nationally. Forecasting for 2022 has got that confidence level as well. Yet I heard on the radio the other day that confidence level from consumers is going down. How could you have such a gap from forecasting, saying everything is doing fine or better? Consumer confidence level in the economy, local and nationally, is going down. There's a big gap there. And to have a proposed government intervention, if you will, gentlemen, they can't even agree what to have for lunch. So how do we solve this problem?
I mean, I'll take that one first, but I think inflation is the top reason why. Everybody's paying so much more for stuff. I think that's the reason why you see that consumer confidence number that's been down. Because everything is just so obvious. At gasoline stations and grocery stores and buying a car or getting a car. President Biden gets zero credit for the stock market, and I'm not sure presidents should ever get credit for the stock market going up or down anyway, but he's getting zero credit for that. And so I just think that there's, I think, and then if you ask people personally, well, how are you doing? They'll say, I'm doing okay. but there's that disconnect.
I follow the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index like a hawk, and that's one of the things that I've noticed over the last few months. It fell out of bed last year, and the last numbers I've seen have not been any better. So I suppose in some sense it may be something of a decoupling that average people are less confident than the people who buy lots of stocks. I don't know.
I think as well that the people have consistently underestimated how well the economy has been doing since April 2020. I mean, we had an initial shock, and then it's been off to the races, ever since. And I think they're just not feeling it.
Yeah.
3 more questions in, so we'll go quickly here. This might be for Doug and Bill both. Richard Needles, how important is immigration policy reform on economic growth? Can we get more workers into the Central High economy through immigration?
Well,
I certainly hope so.
Yeah, I mean, we could. We have such a workforce shortage that I'm sure that we could handle the influx.
Well, the immigration policies federally have really put a damper on all this stuff. I mean, these workers are desperately needed.
Yeah, but I'm an immigrant, so I understand the concern here. But immigration under what conditions? Are we using immigration to race to the bottom in the labor force? Or are we using immigration to fuel the economy under the right conditions? That remains to be determined. I'm not going to be looking forward to more immigration to drive the market down, the labor market in terms of wages and working conditions. So it has to be under the right conditions for people to thrive.
Good afternoon. I'm Amy Rosenthal with National Church Residences. I appreciate the acknowledgement of the need for housing, specifically affordable housing. But my question is more about your thoughts on universal health, childcare, universal childcare. I don't think I heard that mentioned at all in this discussion yet.
I gave it kind of a glancing discussion when I was talking about the cost of childcare. But certainly that is keeping a lot of folks out of the market. There is no doubt about that. Yeah. And we do need more funding. We need a national policy, which we don't have. And for Head Start.
I have got, during the pandemic, I have got a whole new level of respect for single moms. Oh my God, what they have gone through since the pandemic has started has just been amazing. And it's just, there are too many things to manage that we talk about workforce. They're not going to come back to work until they have a place where they can take their children that's affordable and quality. And so something needs to be done.
Child care workers earn on average, if memory serves, around $12.41 an hour. I mean, give me a break.
I mentioned earlier the MIT Living Wage database, which you should check out because they also break down for every county in the country the biggest ticket items for families in childcare, and this is pre-pandemic. Childcare is one of the biggest ones, in addition to rent and so on. That's point number 2. Point number 1. Point number 2, in terms of childcare, affordable childcare, it's workers again, the wages in the industry, but it's also in terms of what it takes to do this as a systematic adjustment, right? Not just for one company, just for one city, but having it at the federal level. This has to be front and center in addition to all the other issues we talked about.
Okay, we've got time for one more quick one.
This will be our last question. This is also from Mindy Wright. Given the Great Resignation and the corresponding idea that a lot of other people have quit to get better jobs, are there other ways to analyze the economy other than unemployment numbers?
The hidden unemployment numbers, yeah. The numbers that are not on the front page. And the BLS, to be fair, reports all the numbers. Yeah. It's just typically we focus on the headline numbers. Yeah. So you have discouraged workers, you have workers who have been kind of not counted in the labor force, not counted as unemployed for a whole series of reasons. Sometimes it's because of a strike. If you're on strike, you're not unemployed. You're not in the labor force because you voluntarily decided not to work. If you've been displaced from the labor force because you're taking care of an elderly family member, or because you're taking care of children. All of those categories, the BLS gives us the statistics, and they tell us we didn't count them as in the labor force, we didn't count them as unemployed, but they do exist. People who are not counted because of lack of affordable transportation. Last time I checked, in the Midwest and rural areas, there is at least 3 million people excluded, not counted as unemployed, because there's no affordable transportation that will get them, or reliable transportation. And these are, by the way, people who have the skills, apply for the job, get the job, in many cases start the job, but can't keep it because they can't show up on time because there's no transportation. So lots and lots of categories of people who are, this is pre-pandemic, by the way. So we have deep structural problems of hidden poverty, hidden unemployment that we didn't even touch. So when we talk about building back better, we're building back the same, not better.
Mark often calls me to ask about the unemployment stats the day they come out. And I have teased him before that the only time I ever look at the unemployment rate is when he makes me.
Such is my life. So with that, we are concluded, and Deb is going to wrap up with concluding remarks.
Well, I was hoping to say that you could join me in finding today's forum encouraging. I'm not sure, but certainly thought-provoking. Please make plans to join us next week for an inspirational forum that while CMC presents Black Girl Rising, featuring Fran Frazier and a panel of other experts. Thank you to our online virtual seat patrons and to the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation for presenting our live stream in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. Thank you to our partner, the Workforce Development Board of Central Ohio, and to the Columbus Dispatch for supporting today's forum. Thank you to our other sponsors, BDO, Fifth Third Bank, the Robert Weiler Company, and Keeler and Nadler Family Wealth. And most of all, special thanks to today's speakers, Doug Buchanan, Fadhel Kaboub, Bill LaFayette, and our moderator, Mark Williams. Thank you all for joining us. We could not do this without you, and we look forward to seeing you next week as the Columbus Metropolitan Club presents another community conversation. Thanks.